Okay. We are very happy to have you here so that you can share about the technologies, about what we do, what our passion. So I think we started this exercise last month with a topic on the bridging web application at scale. And then this time around we wanted to talk about security, because from the moment that you start bridging web applications, especially sensitive web application, we need to make sure that the security is a key concern that we need to address from the get-go. So talking about Irembo is a technology company where we build platform for government services. We also have a payment platform. And our engineering team, we have different functions. We have software engineering, quality assurance, security, infrastructure. So we do DevOps, Kubernetes, all those cool technologies that you can think about. We do most of them when they serve our customers. Like we don't just do technologies for the sake of doing technologies. We do them to make sure that our customers are safe. And our culture is very open, so you can see our space. And we are also very keen to make sure that our engineers can work from wherever they are. So we have a very friendly remote policies. Yeah. So yeah, that's it. So I would like to thank you again to join the event, and thank you, and thanks our guests for coming, and we hope that we'll learn a lot from them today. Yeah. Thank you, and enjoy your evening.
Thank you. So I'll just also, thank you so much, Patrick. I'll just introduce our panelists today. So I'll start from Guylaine. Guylaine is the Chief Cybersecurity Standards Officer at the National Cybersecurity Authority. So the NCSA coordinates national cybersecurity functions across the private and public sectors to ensure security and resilience of the Rwanda ICT ecosystem. So we're so glad to have you here, and to also have some of her colleagues here too. So thank you for joining us. We also have Jeremiah, who is the lead software engineer at One Acre Fund. I think some of you also here registered to be part of this event. One Acre Fund helps improve the harvests of over 1 million African smallholder farmers. So thank you so much for being here. Then we have our security lead, who is Geoffrey Njogu. He is a security and privacy lead here at Irembo. So what he ensures, we have a good security posture from all the way from design to when we're maintaining our code. And he also has a few of his teammates here as well, Kevin and John Bright. So yeah, today we're talking about the security of web applications at scale. Security is a very core component of why we do things, and we should think about it from all the way from design, coding, deploying, to maintaining. So even in this conversation we're having today, it's going to be structured in that way. From the get-go, from when we design our APIs to when we design our requirements, how are we thinking about security until the time we're deploying and maintaining and making sure there are no incidents when we're in production. So yeah, I'll start with design. Geoffrey, if you have your mic on. As a security team at Irembo, what do you think are the contributions of in the design phase of a feature or a product?
Thanks. So yeah, as you said, I think security is one of the things that is usually overlooked, especially when we are designing something. Let's say a feature or product. On the design phase, once the requirements are gathered, I think now that's when a security person or anyone who is designing should start thinking about security. You first start with privacy. From the Irembo perspective, we first look at the privacy. Like, is this data that I'm collecting, is it needed? Why am I collecting this? How should I collect it? Then now you start going deeper into the functional requirements, where you're looking at the logical part of it. So when you're looking at the logical part of it, you're looking at, do I need something like authorization and authentication? For someone to use your application, like, what should I see before I'm logged in? What should I see after I'm logged in? So those are some of the things that we do consider when we're doing our design. Then after that, then there is, now you come back to the design principles. Something like list privileges. You come up with a matrix on operations, let's say the CRUD operations, and you're coming up with the people who use this feature. And then now under all the roles, you map it to the CRUD operations. What exactly should a specific role be involved in terms of crude operations on the application. Then also on the design level, we're also thinking about, now that's where we start thinking about the compliance. Yeah. We start thinking about if we do anything, what exactly can we do to be within the laws of the country, yeah, to follow the laws of the country. So yeah, those are some of the things that we do consider when we're doing the design.
Yeah, thank you for that, and we'll go deeper into that later on. So I just want to jump to Jeremiah, who is a software engineer, and like many of other people who came to this talk. What are, in the design phase before a product, what are the ways maybe 1acre or even in your previous experience designing an API or designing technical architecture of your product, how do you think for security?
Yeah, for sure. I think that especially the type of work that we work in, we deal with a lot of like farmers and underserved, underrepresented people, and we want to make sure that their data is sort of protected as much as possible, because they may not have the same voice that a lot of us who stay in cities and things like that have. So from the very beginning, even the UX team is sensitized on the importance of things like masking information. So, you know, all our services at like development and QA do not expose pharma information. Like, we don't even see the names when we're developing, right? The names are masked out. We have anonymizing algorithms at those particular stages, so that developers don't get to see pharma information. So I think the design for us as software engineers starts even at UX level. For instance, if I'm designing a product that is let's say a cryptocurrency application, I need to make sure that the Ethereum address or whatever address that I put in my product at the UX point has been sort of masked out. You've seen those designs where you have like 4 digits at the beginning of your address and 4 digits at the end of your address, and like XX's in the middle. I think those are things that UX, should be sensitized about. And I think another important thing is the designing or securing the workflow itself. One of the workflows that I'm actually surprised that here in Africa we allow it to happen is where I can go on Momo or Airtel or whatever, and I can just punch in phone numbers and get people's information. To me, that is something that should be protected, right? Like, and it's actually in my home country, that's the #1 form of hacking, right? Where people just kind of find out some information about you and then they call you. Yeah. So, to me, design starts at that level. Designing the security starts at that level, protecting the workflows, protecting the UX, and we could go deeper and talk about API, backend, we could talk about architecture, we could talk about database, but I think a lot of the time we overlook at the design phase in terms of the UX and the workflows.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of a challenge in a third world country as ours to balance the security and balance the access that they have. Most people have feature phones, so how do you balance how do you balance all of that? Yeah. So I'll go to Guylaine. NCSA does a lot of recommendations and building laws to recommend different web applications or different institutions about security. So how does NCSA recommend different institutions that we design web applications for security?
Thank you. So the main mission of NCSA is to build the skills and capabilities necessary to secure the Rwanda's cyberspace. So how we do that, we collaborate with other public and private institutions and other ICT-related other institutions that do ICT-related things to make sure that whatever they do it in a secure way. So that means one of our responsibilities is to develop policies, guidelines, or standards that these institutions will base on to secure the data, to secure the systems, to secure the networks, but also to make sure that the people's data or services that they collect and process and host is done in a secure way. And some other things we do is that we provide technical support through the Rwanda Computer Security Incident Response Team to individuals or members of the public or private institutions who have been victim to incidents or who just want guidance. So what we normally do is that we work with other sector regulators to make sure that there are guidelines in place that will help or direct institutions under those sectors on how they are supposed to secure their data, their systems, or the services that they provide to their clients or customers. And some of the other things that we do is that once we get advisories or alerts on key vulnerabilities that have been identified on certain technologies, we put out advisories or alerts to institutions to make sure that they know what to patch or what to correct or what to improve on. But also, we also reach out to through our technical teams when they see some of the vulnerable systems that are available publicly, or some of the things that need to be flagged out and communicated to institutions. We reach out to them so that they are handled ahead of time. And another thing that we do, but for the general population, is that we are supposed to increase their awareness on cybersecurity, cyber threats, cyber risks, so that they actually, even to the people who use these applications, the end users know actually when the cyber criminals are using those particular applications to target them, on how they can also protect themselves, not just addressing the technical teams, but also even the general population, the end users. It's an ongoing process. NCSS started in end of 2020, so I think we are on a good track. Well, other people will comment on that, but in addition to what my fellow panelist Geoffrey said, there's a law that was just launched last year on the protection of personal data and privacy, and that law also requires not just institutions themselves, but even people who develop these applications that collect people's personal data, on knowing how to secure actually the data, but also make sure that the data that you're going to ask for, like you mentioned, you are requesting it for a particular purpose. You're not just requesting it, but also you will also collect it or process it when that person has given you the consent to do so, which is not like a mandatory thing, which was not a mandatory fact before, but now institutions are encouraged to do that as well.
Yeah. That makes sense. Thank you so much. So going to the other phase of building, which is coding, when we have gotten the functional and non-functional requirements, this is a stage where the software engineers start to code and we start building products. So in that sense, Jeremiah, what are the ways that you code for security, either on the UI, the backend, your APIs, or when you're integrating with different systems? How do you ensure that your code is not penetrable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the challenge with coding is that you want to move as quickly as possible. Yeah. And sometimes security can be, let's just say, it can feel like a hindrance to that. Your PM is asking for a deadline, right? Yeah. And so the tendency, if you're not careful, is to kind of think about security at the very end of the project, to say, let's build it, let's make it work, and then let's slap on like security at the end. But I think it has to start with embracing that, for my team, for instance, I think doing the hard things first and I think this is mostly for like senior engineers or leads, they should build tooling that make everybody else sort of fall into the pit of success, right? So you cannot trust on the goodwill of your developers to do the good thing, because they will do it today, tomorrow they will do it, and then on Friday they'll forget. But if the tools are good enough, then they have no choice but to fall into the pit of success, right? So these are things like ensuring that there is maybe a starter project that already has some of the hard things set up for them, right? These are things like, for instance, one model that I like is to use this idea of a sidecar, right? So if you're building, especially a cloud-native application, you would build the application in the same way that a developer would build it, but you would have a sidecar next to it, which takes care of communicating with the outside world, communicating with databases, and so the developer doesn't have to think about those particular things, right? So they just think about the business logic. The sidecar takes care of the hard things like, service-to-service invocation, database integration, and stuff like that. And I think if you invest in the right tools, then you will embed security into the product. But having said that, there's still some best practices that obviously you cannot automate. Things like exceptions. I'm sure you've seen going into a website and you see a Laravel exception page, right? Or a Django exception page. Those things should not be exposed to. I should not know that you're using Django on your application, right? I should not know that you're using whatever framework that you use. So and I think the key to that is to have a very good environment culture where you know that the dev environment exposes certain things, and because as a developer you need to see those exceptions. But as a user, I've seen, actually that's a good example. I've seen some examples where people are saying cannot connect to local host at this particular username, right? On a public website. Yeah. And this is a user, that's just free information for a hacker. So, but how do you ensure that that information is visible only for the developer and not for the user? And I think that's where you need to have good environments to say, in dev, this is what we expose, and we turn off this page, and then in production, this page is instead put on. But those things, again, I think it's up to the team leads and the senior engineers. If senior engineers are here, this is your job to do the hard things, so that the rest of the team just kind of doesn't have to think about them, in my opinion. Yeah.
So I think, Guylaine, maybe you can add on to how do you balance that speed for implementing with actually building for security?
I think I may not be the right person to ask that, because basically our institution, for us, we are encouraging to focus on the security part. So there's a concept, I think you mentioned, security by design. So from the moment you even come up with the requirements, the security aspect has to come first. It has to be included, not necessarily first, but it has to be included. For example, I'll give you some of the web applications that we see, for example, in the public sector. We see that sometimes they did not think about how are the credentials going to be secured, how are they going to be updated. Did you, when you're coming up with the requirements, did you make sure that even the password that you set is going to require the user to update it after a certain time, that you don't just give that person the ability to update it when they want, especially to applications that are accessed by a lot of people or that host maybe say government data or sensitive data or citizens' data, or something, for example, that we have also started asking the systems that are being developed now is to make sure that they adopt multi-factor authentication by default. So when we talk about security, for us, we think that now as we develop these applications, we should make sure that the security part of it has to be included as you develop even the requirements, because it will help even when you test whatever you have developed at a certain stage. You test the different. We know the most common talked about OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, which help you actually to see that the application that you're preparing to put out is secure before you publish it. So those are I think that's what I can mention, because security has to come together with making sure that the application developing is easier to use, but even the security aspect has to be built within.
Yeah, makes sense. So yeah, Geoffrey, the security man here, how do you ensure that the code and the tools that the engineers are using, they're secure enough and they're up to standard before deployment?
I think when I spoke of design, I only touched on the product design level. So now, before even code is written, we go through another design review, where that's the technical design. So when the engineers sit down and draw their diagrams, come up with the logic that is driving the business logic, again, now you have to first review that, and asking the bigger questions that the developers hate. Why this? Why not this? I think they hate that back and forth. Then now, after that, now we have, we are also very OWASP heavy, dependent. So we have the secure coding standards, because you want, when an application is being written, you want it to be written on the defensive programming side of view. Like input validation, is it being done? Do we have parameterization? Do we have data, maybe canonicalization? There is a lot of things that happens within the input validation part of it. So I think OWASP, the secure code standards have 14 concepts. Yeah. They do cover that. Then there is something else that we use when we are eliciting the security requirements. It's the OWASP application security verification standards. So even before you write your code, I'll let you know that a password needs 8 characters and above, and it needs to accommodate more than 64 characters. Space characters are needed. Those are some of the requirements that we get, and we borrow them from OWASP. We like working on the shoulders of the people who came before us, instead of reinventing the wheel. So we borrow a lot of requirements from that. Then now, when it comes to writing code, there is the code review or the peer review. Before someone merges a feature, someone else has to review that, just to ensure they're not doing their own thing. They could be maybe changing something in there so that they can benefit from it. So at least to ensure there is maybe separation of duties, like the person who pushes the code is not the person who merges, is not the person who comes up with the release. Yeah, so we ensure there is that kind of division just for that. Also now on the programming part of it, we also have, just for readability purposes, linting. There are some people who don't, there's a structure, and it becomes easier when each and every person follows the same structure when you're doing the review. So we advocate for linting on the IDE level, so at least by the time you're pushing your code, it matches what you as a company or you as the development team has agreed upon. So yeah, those are some of the things that we do just to ensure.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that as well. I think you've touched on a very interesting point in terms of the reviewing part of the code. And I come back to this general theme that I like, which is never to trust the goodwill of the developer, right? Because on a Friday afternoon, you've got a deadline. You're not going to think about security. It's just not going to happen, right? So what we try to do is we try to make our build processes or our review, when you make a pull request, the checks that GitHub is going to give you. We use whatever tool, whether you're using GitHub Actions or you're using Azure Pipelines. DevOps, the checks that are going to happen, we try to make them as difficult as possible to pass, right? So what are you checking for? As you said, you're checking for linting. Is your code well linted? You're checking, there's a lot of tools now, like Snyk, that is going to have a database of all the vulnerabilities, all the major vulnerabilities, and it's going to tell you that there's this thing in your code automatically, right? There's other tools that actually, I can't remember, maybe my colleagues who are here might remember, they actually will tell you that this version of this package has been upgraded, and it's just a PR way to make that, So investing in all these tools, another tool we use is Sonar Cloud. Sonar Cloud helps to check for code complexity. So it will actually tell you that your if statements are too nested, okay? Can you bring them into one level? Otherwise, the code will not pass. And why do you do all these things? Because these are easy things to set up one time and forget about them. But the developers will have to be dealing with them every single time that they want to merge their code. And it's much easier, because even on a PR, there's with a manual human code review, there's a joke that says, if you give an engineer like 100 lines, if you give them 10 lines of code, they'll come up with 10 suggestions. If you give them 100 lines of code, they'll come up with one suggestion, right? So if I see like 23 files that have changed and I need to review them, I'm just gonna skim through them and say approve, okay? But if I see 10 lines, I'm going to like try to see if there's any issues. So you want to try and automate a lot of those processes at build time so that the human is sort of removed from there. You should only be checking for things that maybe the computer cannot check, right? So that's just what I wanted to add on that part.
Yeah, you can check like for the business logic that maybe the computer doesn't know.
Yeah.
Because they don't know your product. And Geoffrey talked about separation of concern. So that's a good topic as we move on to the next phase, which is deployment. So how do you, Geoffrey, make sure that the software engineers are not the ones touching the servers and the ones touching the deployment? So putting that separation in also the deployment phase.
Okay. So I think when we go now to, okay, now you've designed, you've written your code, now it's on Git or where your repos. So one of the things that you have to first ensure is that your deployment can be reproduced. So that means it's just automated. So we bring in a concept that the DevOps team doesn't like to hear called DevSecOps, where we're just looking for concepts nowadays. You take a word, you throw in sec in there. So DevSecOps is the process where you're just embedding security within the pipeline. So some of the things that we do, as he mentioned, there was we use one open source tool that's called the OWASP dependency checker, that is again combined with SonarLint and some Sonar source that now tells you whether your dependencies are vulnerable or not. So that's the first step. Then now there is the static code analysis. So for us, we use SonarCube because we like to host this in-house. In as much as we have, we don't want to introduce another SolarWind where you bring in a tool that you think is really good, but now the tool is used against you. So we like to do our things in-house. So now we have no SonarCube. So we run our code through SonarCube. That's when now you realize a developer had coded some credentials in there. Now you're asking on why are you using declarative instead of imperative security controls. Those kind of things. Then now memory leakage, that's also some of the things that happens in there. Then now after that, because we use Java, it's packaged. After that, then there's the Dockerization part of it. So we have to go through the code that these people write, or the Helm charts, because also security, you can hard code your values in there. The file system, what I'm building, it should not be able to read or write on the file. Okay, it should not be able to write on the file system. So there's the permissions bit of it. I want the least privilege. I want my application to run with the least privileges possible, so that in case of any compromise, it doesn't affect the underlying operating system. So there is that. Then there is something called the software composition analysis, where you're coming up with the BOM, the build of materials. So you take a Docker container, you run it through maybe something like Tailsman, or just to check on the dependencies that have been, or anything that has been used to build that Docker container. Does it have vulnerable stuff? But there's something that we should be doing that we don't do, which is maybe checking the signature of that Docker container before even you start using it. Because again, you can use some Docker container that was written by someone else, by Geoffrey, a security guy who was just trying to experiment. Then you use it, and now you'll be vulnerable to most of the things that I've written. Then now after that, that's where it's automated. For us internally, because we are Kubernetes heavy, we are cloud native heavy, so we use Argo CD, just to ensure the deployment is automated. We try to reduce as much as possible the human error, but we also introduce a concept called human in the loop. You don't just necessarily trust the system. There's also a human person in there who is just in there verifying and validating everything that is happening. So yeah, that's another process.
Thank you for that. So Jeremiah, does that ring a bell with what you do at 1 Acre Fund? Dockerize your containers?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the stuff is similar. I think obviously you're more knowledgeable about the security best practices.
Yeah.
But yeah, for sure, we're also cloud heavy. We use Kubernetes a lot. We've got 3 clusters for QA, prod, and development. I don't know if it's best practice from a security point of view to tell you how many clusters you have. But what I can say though is that in terms of separation of concerns, one thing that we found out is that we want to draw a line. It's a very difficult line. It keeps moving, right, between what the DevOps team is going to take over versus what the responsibility of the DevOps versus the responsibility of the devs, and that becomes a blurred line. But one thing we found is that developers should know how to build their applications, i.e. should know how to write their own Docker files.
Yeah.
And they should know exactly what environment variables go into those Docker files. And at the very least, they should come up with at least a Docker compose file to be able to run that in a replicatable way. And then at that point, the DevOps team can convert that information into a Kubernetes definition file, right? But for some more advanced developers, senior engineers, etc., then they could even go a step further in terms of writing their own Helm charts for their applications. And we like Helm because it's very easy to swap out your values because you don't want values to be determined by developers. For instance, developers can give their application 4 gigabytes of RAM when it really only needs 500 megabytes. So those are decisions that the DevOps team would need to make. So what we try to do is to make sure that developers have the same environment that's running in production available on their local machine. So maybe Minikube or MicroK or whatever micro Kubernetes environment that they have, so that at least they can try out some of these things. Some of these are very machine heavy, so we kind of try to invest in the best tools for developers to have so that they don't have an excuse. So MacBook Pros and stuff like that, so that they can at least run Minikube on their local machines. But one thing that I would like to say though, which I don't think we touch upon a lot when we talk about security from a coding perspective, is the front end, right? The front end is not really considered too much. But I would like to say that there's also a lot of security vulnerabilities that are in the front end. For instance, for the last 5 to 8 years, we've been taught that single page applications are the way to go, right? Create React app. And it turns out that the question that nobody is able to answer is, where do you store your API keys? Where do you store your JWT token in a Create React application? And it turns out that we put it in local storage. No, we don't know, right? And so now we're kind of moving back to say, no, actually, let's render all our pages from the server. So you've got server-side generation. I think these are things that we need to consider, right? How much information should we make available on the browser? Because the browser is very insecure. Anybody could just open up, just right-click, okay, and they could have access to all of your local storage. They could have access to your IndexedDB. They could have access to even your browser-side cookies. So you need to be careful how you design your front-end applications, because you could have the most secure back-end, but if there's a portal to that back-end through the front-end, then you would have messed up all that work. So one thing that we've found is to try and build front ends to try and server generate, pre-build the front ends as much as possible. Because if you think about an About Us page, how often does it change, right? You update it once. Your privacy policy page, how often does it change, right? Maybe once or twice in a year. You don't need to hit a database every time somebody is looking for that page, right? Pre-build it, pre-render it, and store it in a CDN somewhere, so that everyone who wants to see your privacy policy page, it's already built, statically. And you can't hack HTML. It's just static HTML. You can't. It's just, it's text, okay? But PHP or whatever that has a connection to your database, that's where the vulnerabilities are. So you need to think about how many pages should you server-side render. How many pages you statically render versus how many pages actually do need a live database or API integration. So those are some of the things to also think about when coding the front end.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. So while you're still on the topic of deploying, Gillian, you talked about the privacy data policy, but also talk about more of that on how we shouldn't store sensitive data maybe on the cloud or anything, but also on the directives and on the other law of network and information systems that you published as well.
Thank you. I think basically on regarding deployment, even on the part of hosting, the law on the protection of personal data and privacy is not specific on saying that the data should not be hosted on the cloud. So what it says or what it recommends is that the best practice or the recommendation will be that the data or the personal data, basically personal data mainly, should be hosted locally in Rwanda. But it doesn't prevent people from hosting it on the cloud, or even the cloud can be in Rwanda or outside Rwanda. But what the law basically means is that the best scenario case for Rwanda will be that the data is hosted in Rwanda, but of course we know that the cost of hosting data in Rwanda, I think, is still quite high, and other costs related to that also makes the price to go high. We know that there are efforts being done by other institutions in Rwanda to see how there can be more flexible ways of enabling institutions or companies, startups to have many options of where they can host their data and for affordable cost. But on the side of NTSA, we request that if you're going to host your data, if it's on the cloud, if it's in Rwanda or elsewhere, you make sure that you have some security measures in place to make sure that even that data will be secure. That in case of a data breach, who do you hold accountable? In case you store that data on the cloud, did you make any agreement with that institution on how they are going to secure the data that you're giving them? And what that means is that do you give them the authority, or do you allow them to also share that data that you've given them, to also have access to it and share it with others without your knowledge, or they have to tell you, or is it prohibited entirely? Another thing that we basically ask is that if you choose to host it with data centers here in Rwanda, you have to make sure that you follow up with them on how they're going to secure the data that is hosted, even on the environment that your data is hosted in, or your systems or your applications, the environment where that data is hosted, that it's updated, that it's secure, because we've seen that not specifically for Irembo, for other institutions that host their data, let's say with the national data center, is that sometimes they just make a contract, they say we're going to host your data, and that becomes the last time they meet with them. Yeah. But they have to continue meeting with them to ensure that, to hold them accountable to what they've signed for on the contract. Yeah. Because sometimes you agree with the data center that they're going to either just give you the space where to put your code, your systems, your application, and you deal with the security part of it, or it's them to do it. But you have to follow up on that. So that's some of the things that we normally encourage institutions, that when it comes to the part of deployment or hosting, or even after the deployment part, how do you make sure that wherever your application is, it's secure, and that you are in charge of making sure that the security part of it is updated and maintained on a regular basis. Yeah. And another thing that we normally request institutions is that if you host your data yourself, or if you have the capability to host your systems yourself, you also implement some security measures, let's say like the web application firewall, which sometimes we see that institutions forget, yet it's the simplest way of securing it. If you're hosting it yourself, if someone else is hosting the application, the system for you, they are the ones in charge of making sure that they have those security measures in place. Another thing when it comes to deployment and hosting is we see that sometimes we forget about the backup side of it, because we only think about we are developing the application, we want to hit a certain deadline. This application should be live at a certain date, and we don't think that in case an issue happens, it may not be a cyber incident. It may be natural hazard. Let's say Kigali is closed off. Is your application, is Irembo going to be unavailable because you don't have a backup in place, you don't have a disaster recovery policy in place. So that's some of the things that we encourage institutions to think about at different stages of, like you said, at different stages of software development. Yeah.
So I think maybe also to add on that, I think she has mentioned very critical and key issues on data and the privacy of a person. So one of the things that we also do maybe on the design level, both technical and the product design level, is consent. You know, like when you're collecting data, what's evidence of consent? You know, like when someone is giving you their data, what is it that you take as that this person consented to give us this data freely? Yeah. You know, there's always the need to put in that feature just for you as an organization to be safe, that we didn't steal your data from anyone, you're the one who gave us this data. And then now the other concept of data also in terms of data privacy, you look at data from the perspective of, okay, from you as, let's say you're a machine, or I'm the server and I need to process something for you. Okay, yes, do I need the first question, do I need your data? Yes, definitely, I do need your data. Do I need this data to store it or just process it? And so if it's just a matter of me processing your data, then that means I don't need to store it. Okay, then another concept comes in. Maybe I need to store it for future reference. Then the question comes into play on how long should I store your data, you know, in terms of data retention. And there is how should I store the data itself, because and then the concept of logging, because I'm the one, you know, from the auditing perspective, you know, you log any event that changes how the system behaves. So what exactly are you logging here in terms of data? Are you logging my name as Geoffrey, Geoffrey of ID 1234 and bank account 2BCD, did this? So there is also that part of the data perspective when we are looking at data. And the last one is a bit, I think I'm forgetting it, I don't know. I've lost my chain of thought.
Yeah, so going to Jeremiah, we're going to the last phase of maintaining. So how do you deal with logging? How do you know what to log or not?
Yeah, before I answer that, I just wanted to just give one more, I guess, thought in terms of everything that my fellow panelists have discussed, is that I think for a lot of these security things, you're not as smart as you think you are. Mm-hmm. So try to reuse things that other people have already done, right? I worked in a bank. My first job was in a bank, right? And in the banking system, I don't know if some of you may know T24, or T24, FlexCube, Finacle. We looked at some of the tables, and this thing had thousands of tables. I used to think that when you make a deposit into an account, it's just going to the deposits table and sitting there, right? It's like 50 tables. Yeah. Right? They denormalize it. Like you can't, even if you got access to the database, you wouldn't know how to stitch the transaction together. Now, if you try to build that yourself, it's a waste of time, right? Use Finacle. They already have it. Just make, build what makes your product unique, right? The banking stuff, use somebody else's product. Same thing with, the other day I was uploading my website, and I put a form to say, you know, reach out to me, right? And then the following day, there's like thousands. I'm like, wow, I'm popular. And it's like, no, it's just spam. It's just bots. No, like literally, there's just bots all over the internet, like just like submitting forms on your website. Now, should I write like a spam algorithm to like, no, like just use reCAPTCHA, okay? Yeah. Just use something that already exists. So I feel like sometimes as engineers, we are over exuberant. We are all trying to re-engineer things that have already been built and like perfected. So my point is, if possible, use components of your, of especially like backend or like specialized components that already exist. Pay a little something and concentrate on what makes your business really valuable and unique. That's what I wanted to say. But in terms of like managing, I think that there are two things. One, we don't really think about designing our logs even, right? We just kind of like, what should we log, like whatever, right? But it's important to have like a strategy on logging, and some of the things that we try to do, as I said, is like making the hard decisions on behalf of the developers, is we try to put logs in centralized places in your application. So if you've used things like the mediator pattern, for instance, where you have your, or like onion architecture or clean architecture, where you have like your presentation layer, you have your application layer, you've got your infrastructure layer, and everything flows through your application layer. If you think of something like Redux, for instance, in React, that's a good place to kind of put your logs, because your application will eventually have to go through that part, right? So you could put you could put like logging information in a part of the application that you know that both the infrastructure and the presentation will have to touch, and therefore the developers, for most parts, don't even have to think about it. Those logs will automatically be generated. Another nice part is to put it in, databases, especially ORMs and stuff like that, have very good logging strategies. So it's just a matter of like figuring out like what you should turn on. Like I like, for instance, Entity Framework, even though I don't think it's the best for everything, but it has some very good policies around logging. So it will tell you how long transaction took. You don't have to be thinking about those things. And then obviously there are certain things that you should be logging that are specific to your business logic. But you should be careful, because I've seen cases where folks have logged things like passwords, and you're looking in ELK, because we use Elasticsearch to see our logs, that you see like, some user passwords or user accounts. No, it happens because people, especially with console log, right? Developers are testing, and instead of debugging, they prefer console logs, right? Especially in JavaScript. And it's like, no, don't, try not to console log, try to learn the debugging tools that your IDEs provide. Because console log is not a debugging tool, okay? But you forget it. You will think that you console log here, and then you think, and it works. You forget to clean up all those console logs. And then now they're logging sensitive information into your log. So that's one thing that I will say. Another thing I will say is try to separate your domain objects from your data transfer objects. So how many times have you seen like an API that says, okay, people, right? And then you add like first name, last name, age, okay? You make a post request, first name, last name, age. You post, and it returns back first name, last name, age, created at, updated at, created by, you know what I mean? All right? That information, it belongs to the domain. It's domain specific. So you should, the problem there is that you use the same model, right, that speaks to your database to also be the model that speaks to your API. You should separate the two. You should have a data transfer object that only speaks to your API and your user interfaces. And you should transform that into your model, so that when you return the data, it only actually just shows even just the name, just the things that the APIs should show. And then finally, I will say one other thing that we don't consider a lot is, and we're guilty of this as well, is the idea of monitoring your applications. Monitoring usually becomes an afterthought, right? Where it's like, now we're in production, so okay, so we've got Prometheus, and the DevSecOps people have done a great job. They've given us Grafana, right? And as a developer, you're looking at this complicated dashboard, right? It says this is your heap usage, and it says this is your network I/O, and it says like it's just, and you don't even know what that information means, and you can't trust the security or DevOps guy to figure out what to monitor for you. You wrote the application. You are the developer. You know what is the most important thing to monitor, right? The DevSecOps guy will be monitoring things like memory usage in your application.
Yeah.
For you, it's like, I don't know, like this doesn't mean anything to me. What means a lot is how many 200 requests did my applications make versus 201s, right? Those are the things that we should think about even at the design part. Like, what are we going to monitor in our application once it's in production? Because that's going to determine how are we going to know if our application is healthy. Usually, we only get to know that application is not healthy when the user calls. But a good system should know that application is not healthy from alerts, from your monitoring tools, right? So we need to add, and as I said, I'm guilty of this as well, but we need to think about what we are monitoring in our application even before we deploy and put it into production.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that. So moving on to Guylaine, this is the last phase of the conversation, but just to close off the conversation that we had of today, but you also mentioned something about when we're integrating with different systems and making contacts with different partners, how to ensure that we have a checklist and we make sure that these people are actually up to standard in security-wise.
Thank you. I think in conclusion, some of the things that we have talked about, they may sound, I don't know, very complex, but usually what we see from all the threats or the alerts that we normally get, they usually, the majority, it's not complicated things or complex things on the code or that have been alerted on. It's normally the easiest things. I think he mentioned when you are developing the code, sometimes we see that some of the complex applications or websites or data repositories that have been compromised, the code to the how do you call it? The admin credentials have been, I don't know, stored in the code, and sometimes it's not something that you can put firewalls, you can put, I don't know, passwords that change every day.
Yeah.
But if we don't remember applying the simplest things of making sure that there's no credentials in the code, there's no stuff that someone that leaves Irembo, for example, doesn't go with all the credentials, or you forget to change them once that person goes, especially for institutions that hire other companies to develop code for them.
Yeah.
Usually we've seen that those companies go with all the information necessary to maintain the system or the application, and that in itself is a security threat to us. I think to your question, we've seen sometimes that when someone is developing an application, they may integrate with different APIs. The most common one is the one for NIDA, but then they add other APIs, but sometimes they don't keep track of all the APIs that they have been integrated with. But also there's a concept that our institution, but also some other institutions that are starting to implement to encourage people to even test the security of those APIs. If the institution responsible of that API updates it, you have to also be, they don't test their backups. So the problem comes that there's an issue, we know that there's a backup, but then we find that the backup was never tested, so it's not useful. And this has happened with different institutions in Rwanda, big and small, where a backup has been even an issue itself. And you find that the customers will be complaining, but the issue came from backup. So another thing is that I think I emphasized on it earlier, is that we are encouraging now applications or web application being developed now to adopt multi-factor authentication by default, because it helps in because we've seen that even other international companies are moving away from using passwords. We're coming up with new concept of that are passwordless.
Yeah.
So before those concepts are used in mass, we should start adopting multi-factor authentication, but also test it because it also has some vulnerabilities within itself. Another thing is that we have to keep up with the trends in either in web development, in security, because it shouldn't just concentrate on developing the best app or the best website ever without forgetting what are the trends in terms of security. Because if they see that your facility here at Irembo is secure, the staff or the employees are knowledgeable, but they will try always. If they see that the user or the admin does not remember to secure their credentials, they will target you through that. So I think the main message is that we don't only deal with the complex development part of our web applications, but we even go back to the basic security practices. I think you mentioned the OWASP top 10. Those are the basic. They are there to help, and they're updated every 3 years or when the need arises to help you identify what do you need to check as you're developing or after the application is in production. If it's for OWASP top 10, there's also OWASP API now, top 10 vulnerability. They're different. Yeah. But also our institution also is available also to help developers or institutions on any guidance that they may require in terms of the security part of it. We know that some certain applications, before they are deployed to the public, they have to either come to an institution or go to other institutions like RISA to make sure that they also test them before they are deployed. But for others, if there are any suggestion, advice that our institution can provide, they can reach out to us.
Yeah, thank you so much. So moving on to Geoffrey, which is the last question. How do you handle...
Maybe can I first touch on the monitoring bit? I feel like I have something to add.
Okay.
sorry about that. So monitoring is one of the things that people take as business as usual. Like if I'm a business owner and my application is out there and running and making me money, why do I need to pay someone to just sit down and look at the logs and look at everything that is happening? So that's why but in the real sense, monitoring is how you know, one, how your application is behaving, and whether or not someone is doing something malicious or like within the application. So monitoring should happen in multiple levels. So we spoke about you deploy something, that's an infrastructure. So you've already added another attack surface here, which is the infrastructure itself. So you first need to monitor your infrastructure. Who are these people who have access to it? Which commands are they running in there? Someone could just be going in there and writing a command directly to your DB. Then now after that, now you have to monitor the traffic that is coming in. So it could be traffic both coming in and going out. The reason why we monitor traffic that is going out, if someone manages, let's say an APT, advanced persistent, that person, yeah, the APT person, they're in your system. You don't know that because they're very stealth. You can't detect that via monitoring. And then now they start doing some data exfiltration. So the only way that you can know that someone is copying data from your servers to their servers is through monitoring the traffic that is going from your servers to theirs. So most of the cases we monitor traffic that is just coming in. Then there is the other command and control. So you've been recruited to a botnet, say Mirai or whichever botnet that is out there, and they're trying to use you to maybe cause a DDoS on someone else. So if you fail to monitor the traffic that is coming out from your servers or from your environment to the external world, you'll never know these things. So So when we are also doing the monitoring, there's also another part that we need to, like we as security engineers or the SOC people in the building. So you already have your defense mechanisms in place. You have, let's say, your next generation firewall. Then you have maybe your API gateway that is doing some level of protection and all that. Then now you have your WAF. Then now again you have maybe your database protection firewall. So we also need to monitor all these things. Something that passes by the WAF, the next generation firewall or whatever firewall that you have, can bypass also the API gateway. You also need to monitor the WAF itself. Then after that, you also need to monitor the database, like which transactions are happening within the DB and who have authorized those kind of transactions. So, and also in terms of monitoring, who has access to your platform? Let's say the DevOps people or whoever is doing your deployment. You know, they definitely need access to your DB just in case of anything happens. So what exactly are they doing in there? So are you monitoring their access requests first? Are you monitoring the activities that they're doing? Yeah, those kind of changes. So in terms of monitoring, I think that's what I had to say.
So now you can answer how you handle 0 days.
Oh, that's a good one. Because so 0 days. So definitely, I think it takes me back to monitoring because if I don't know what is happening within my application, within my infrastructure, then I think I won't detect that 0 day. But one of the things that security engineers or security people need to do, they need to be engaged with the community, the security community, because that's where the intelligence is. If we are seated right, we might in December we are preparing to go for Christmas. You have your plane ticket, maybe you have you booked something. Then all of a sudden you hear there's Log4j. You don't know. I'm sure a lot of us didn't have a very good Christmas because of that. So how we realized there was Log4j was first the community itself. You enrolled to a lot of newsletters. Maybe you're in Discord with people like BHIS or all those open source communities, MISPs and all those people. So they first report that there is an attack or there is a vulnerable component that is being actively exploited. So then after that, as a security engineer or a security person, it's just a person. So one of the things that you need to do is, again, now go back to your components. So what exactly is being exploited? Most of the time, they're usually components. Okay, do you have these components? So that's why it's usually necessary for you as an organization to have a list of all the materials that have been used to build your applications. If you're using a framework, what version is it? If you are using dependencies, which versions are these? If you're using other tools, maybe Grafana, Prometheus, which versions are these? You need that information. So you take the information that is out there and juxtapose it with what you have and see whether you're vulnerable. Then because of the concept of layered defense, you might be vulnerable to Log4j, but because of the layers that you have, the exposure factor has been reduced to almost 0. There is that concept. You might be vulnerable, but you can't be exploited because of the layers that you have. So that's also something else that you need to put in place so that you can know how to prioritize this thing. I mean, if it's not that bad, then if you're going for Christmas. But now something else, let's say you're vulnerable or you want to know whether you're vulnerable because you already have all your, maybe you have your WAF, they have not yet updated their signature definitely. So you take the code that is out there, which is definitely the exploit, you customize it for your application because you want to try it yourself. If I run this exploit against my UAT, definitely no production. If I run it against my test production, my test environment, what kind of log should I expect? Then once you run it, will it be successful? So if it's successful, now that's a P1, definitely, because now there is some code out there that can be used against you. Then now 2, how do I detect this? So now that's why when you ran it, you saw the kind of logs that were generated. You saw how your RASP, when it's, or when the application itself is running, you saw its response. So now at least now you know what to monitor, you know what to look out for. Then after that, now that's when you assemble a war room. You call in everyone else because you have to escalate these. One, you've already seen that you are susceptible to its attack. So now you need to notify the business owner because the business owner carries the entire risk. yeah, there's some residual, the residual risk, there's a threshold, but now the business owner is the one who should say whether or not, and because they are the ones who are providing the resources, they are the one who will be, that's when now you activate the incident response plan. That is if you have one. So, I mean, that is if you have one. So yeah, that's how you, that's how you handle 0 days.
Yeah, thank you so much, Geoffrey. Now we know Irembo is protected. So yeah, I think some people don't agree, but okay. So I think we've come towards the end. So if you have any questions, we'll get 5 questions. Not you now. 5 questions and then we go. Yes, Ali.
Okay, thank you. My question goes to Geoffrey. So when I started have nightmares, it's when they told me that you have to test, especially in front-end testing React. I would like to ask you, on the scale of 1 to 10 in security, the TDD, test-driven development, which level, how much do you, where can you scale it? And my very small question goes to my sister and Mr. Jeremiah. Do you read the terms and conditions?
So, the TDD, or test-driven development. Okay, rating it from a scale of 1 to 10, I would say, well, I think I was once in class and there was this professor who, whenever you ask a question in terms of security, the only answer that he gave you was, it depends. So because definitely, if you look at privacy, it's on a case-by-case basis, right? So each and every question or each and every security-related question it depends, unless you have some context back to it. So if you can maybe wrap some context into the question, like the environments that we're talking about here, the application itself, the functionalities that it's doing.
I think it's quite more in general, because I do believe that a lot of developers, if it's about testing, will write the test after we've implemented all the functionalities. So is that really necessary to go into TDD instead of going straight to the development?
So
maybe Jeremiah can also answer.
Yeah, I wanted to add that after me, I think Jeremiah will also will also add to that. But TDD helps. Like QA, I can see some QAs here, and they are really happy with that question, because when you test as you write your code, it reduces the number of bugs. So if I am a business owner, or I'm from the security perspective, and you do your own testing, that means you're cutting costs in re-engineering, because if you just write your code, push it out there, you have to come sit down and you have to start redesigning. So to avoid the whole loop of you going back to zero, I think it's more advisable for you to go with the TDD approach. And when you're doing your tests, make sure you're not just doing the functional test. Are you doing negative tests? Are you bringing into concept the edge cases? Are you trying to test on the race conditions? Like, are you trying to identify whether something needs to be the mutex or the concurrency or the exclusive concurrent kind of processes? So I think the TDD is a very good approach. Maybe from 1 to 10, I can give it a 10.
I think I can just say a little bit about the TDD, and then I'll let her speak about terms and conditions. But basically, and I think this is a big misconception that we have as developers. Test-driven development is not about testing. It's about design. Okay? Test-driven design and development. So basically, it's about, we think it's about testing because the word test comes first, but it's really about designing your application in a test-first manner. So what happens is that you can be given a spec, right? But if you keep it all in your head, you're gonna go crazy, right? No one person can have the same cognitive load, right? That usually goes into the complexity of our applications. So what you do is you commit, instead of committing your requirements to memory, you commit it to a test before you write code. So what did they want me to say? They wanted me to push data in a database with, you know, like 35 characters. So you test first to say, can I get back, you know, if I put 40 characters, will it throw an error, right? You've put a test, then you write the code. So it's actually about specs and design. It's not about testing. So in terms of like your question, in terms of how does it help, in terms of 1 to 10, I would say that from a test perspective, it's not actually, I don't think it's actually as effective in terms of security as it is about you understanding the requirements. Because remember, requirements will always evolve, right? And the good thing about when you have those tests from TDD is that when you identify a bug, actually, that's the greatest thing about TDD. When you identify a bug, right, the first thing you do is you write a test for that bug. So now you've added to your memory footprint even more things that you could have just kept in your head. So I don't think it's an effective security practice, but I think it's an effective design practice. That's what I can say.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I think, in addition to terms and conditions, I think I'll add even privacy settings, because the web platforms usually have privacy settings, the ones you log into, and then we have terms and conditions, especially for the applications and other things that we install on our machines. So honestly, myself, before I joined NCSA, I never used to bother. But now, because I'm in NCSA and within my role of in charge of cybersecurity standards, I make sure I read the terms and conditions and all the privacy settings to customize them or to see actually what they do. Because I think some of the things that we mentioned earlier is that our institution is the one that will be in charge of making sure that institutions comply with the law on protection of personal data and privacy. One of the things is that they have to register with NCSA, which is the supervisory authority. And when they register, they have to tell us what they collect, why they collect it, how is it hosted, how is it secured, how long, like you said, how long are you going to collect that data for? And if we don't actually read it, we are not going to be able to make sure that they actually do it. So one thing that we have started doing is that we make sure that we read the terms and conditions of these things or privacy settings of these platforms, because even these Facebook, Google, Twitter, in these 2 years, up from 2021 to 2023, we are also talking with them to make sure that they also comply with these laws. And how you do that, you actually go through the privacy settings or the terms and conditions that they provide to make sure that they actually say what is complying with your law. And another thing on why you should read the terms and conditions and privacy settings is that this is where you actually see normally where the data that they collect, it's usually where they put it. If you don't know, because we've seen people complaining about these social media platforms, people complain that they've used their data, they've used their whatever they've put on those platforms, and usually when you put those things on those platforms, that means that you've consented to their privacy settings or their terms and conditions. And if you don't go through them, then you're not going to tell them that, why have you used this? Yet you have said, when you're registering, you see terms and conditions, you see privacy settings, you see other different terms that they use to discourage people from reading them. And when you just don't read them, because they usually even give you the option of customizing, like what you accept, what you don't accept. And yeah, briefly, I think because of the responsibilities I have, it's one of the things that I have to do now. For example, I don't know if you've seen, like YouTube, they have said that they're going to update the terms and the privacy settings or terms and conditions by December or January, if I'm not mistaken. So you have to read that as well.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah. And maybe one thing that I can add on, I think some of the telcos like MTN, they have also started issuing out SMSs for you to agree, to read and agree to the terms and conditions of MTN for you to be on mobile money or to use their services, which is one of the requirements of this law, is that you give consent. If you don't consent, don't give consent for these institutions to hold your data, then that means whatever they're going to do will not be in compliance with the law, or they will just stop giving you the services that they provide you with. And one thing that you're encouraging institutions, either local or international companies, is to make sure that they develop easy to understand terms and conditions, or privacy terms and conditions, privacy settings, for end users to be able to easily understand them, but also not make them very, very complicated or very long. So it's an ongoing process. I think that's what I can say. But so I encourage you to to read them as well.
I have a question on that. Does Irembo have terms on privacy in local languages?
So this is for Geoffrey. Let's say Irembo is hacked now. What would you do? Do you shut down the servers to give you time to mitigate, or like what would you do about it? And maybe I can list down my questions and you guys can pick it. So the next is for Jeremiah. Let's say you join the company and they have maybe an obsolete code base, legacy code base, and it has a lot of vulnerabilities. How would you go around it? Would you prefer to build something new, or spend your years there trying to fix those vulnerabilities? And the last is for Gillian. Yeah, let's say you are, I'm not using Rwanda as an example. Let's say you are in a government where they are not actually progressive. Let me just give an example. Maybe, let's say NIDAS API, they use SOAP API. If you have integrated with SOAP, you know how painful it is. How do you legislate around that to help the security or the developers around?
We answer with that order.
Can you clarify?
So my question is around a government that you work with the government sector, I believe. Let's say the government is not progressive with regards to innovation. How would you be able to step in your position? Basically, you are in charge of cybersecurity. You know the trend in the world. How would you be able to form that bridge between what is innovative and what is...
First, I think I hope that's not a prayer. Yeah. So that's where now the incident response. You know, if you have playbooks, now that's where now you start activating them, and set up your war room. Definitely, because you have to respond and recover. So my first thing that I will do, definitely, if we are hacked, okay, again, it depends. Because I mean, if it's ransomware and all your servers are dead, you don't have an option. You just have to go off. Yeah, but if, let's say, you detect like something is actually happening, so the first step is usually triaging. You know, you want to differentiate between the false positive. You want to be sure that there is something that is happening and how it's happening. So once you have maybe like an 80% that this is not false, you know, this is something that is actually happening. So now the escalation, because the war room has already been formed based on your incident response. So you have the person who is communicating to definitely your partners. We have to be compliant. You have to communicate whenever we have a breach. And then now internally, then you have to now, the war room is in charge of recovery. How do you recover from these? So as I said again, it So I think, yeah, that's it, because as I gave the example, you know, if you're recovering and you don't have a failover site, as I said, it depends. That means you have to go off. But the last call on whether all the servers must be turned down or not is usually on the business owner. So I am supposed to maybe give advisory. Okay, we have done this and this and this. This is the risk. All our data might be exposed and NCSA will sue us. You know, that's my responsibility, because I'm the one who is on the security perspective. So give you all the options, but now the last call on whether we go off or not is on the hands of the business owner.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you're satisfied. So, Gillian, can you answer his interview question?
Yeah, maybe on the question you had asked Geoffrey, I think usually when an incident happens, it depends on the type of incident, because there's usually there are types of incident that an institution can handle themselves and it's not a big issue, but there are other incidents where you have to communicate to other institutions, if it's NCSA, if it's other institutions that, especially for Irembo, there are other institutions that need to be communicated in case it's a major incident. And they have to be, like you said, there needs to be an incident response plan in place that will help you, guide you on what to do in different types of cases of incidents. Because if you don't have a response plan, then you won't know what to do, what to start from, what to do next, and even us, the NCSA or other institutions will be asking you, like, what's happening, what do you want to fix it fast, and an incident response plan is usually key, and we encourage other institutions or other companies, startups represented here to have an incident response plan in place, because it helps. Yeah. And on the question on how does NCSA come in when certain institutions don't want to secure themselves in relation to the current cyber threat landscape, what we normally do is, like I mentioned, we work with private institutions, and we normally we avoid pushing an institution right, like at the beginning. We usually first deal with or work with a sector regulator who will help or will support the institution in question on how to better secure their systems or the services that they provide. But if there's we as NCSA, because we normally do assess the current, we assess the cyber risk status in the country. When we see that, and with that, we normally start with we concentrate mainly on owners of critical information infrastructure. And when we see that there's a loophole that needs to be fixed, we'll approach you and advise you on what security measures that you have to put in place, and we show you the risk that may arise if you don't fix those vulnerabilities. But for the question, for example, you said of NIDA or other institutions, NIDA is because it's the one that is mostly, I don't know, connected to or used. It's something that has to be done in plan, because you can't do changes on something that will be used by that will be required by other systems, by various systems, and it's something that has to be planned with the institution in question, or with ourselves, with other institutions as well, to make sure that if there's any major upgrade or major improvement that needs to be done, it will be done also in a secure way. Because if it's not done, we just tell them do this, it has to be taken into consideration other dependencies or other systems that depend on that particular application in question. So what NCSS does is to recommend, but if there's a major requirements that those institutions have to implement, we work with them to make sure that it's implemented. And especially for the law on the protection of personal data, there are certain security measures that institutions will have to put in place, especially with the example of NIDA that you mentioned, but also telcos, financial institutions, that it will require them to change certain aspects, and hopefully by October 2023, all changes will have been made. But if there's any requirements, there's usually a place or an opportunity for these institutions to meet and discuss these various issues that may be there, and we see how collectively how to fix them.
Thank you so much, Ghislaine, and thank you so much to our panelists. I think this concludes our talk.
No, I wanted to ask a question after he answers. I think there was a question that was directed to him. Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I think he asked if I were to join Irembo. First of all, I really hate Java, so unless you move to something like Golang or Rust or something cool like that, yeah. But I also wanted to say, like, in terms of like if Irembo was hacked, in my opinion, I think if Irembo has 100 microservices, one for each module that they serve, and one database attached to each microservice, and they're all communicating asynchronously through an event bus, the question becomes which microservice got hacked, right? So you don't turn off the whole thing. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is if you design your applications well in the right architecture, then you also decrease the footprint of where somebody could hack a whole institution. Coming back now to the question that you asked, I think that as engineers, we need to develop a vocabulary that we can go to business to talk to them about what the risk of things like security vulnerabilities and also testing and best practices means. Usually, what engineers do is they say, oh, I finished the feature, now I need to write a test for it. The question should be that feature should include the test, and that feature should include the security best practice that you need to put. So when the business asks you, how long will it take for you to design this section of the page, you don't say how long it will take you for you to actually develop it. You consider all the other things, and you say, actually, it's going to take me 7 days. And they say, well, why? It's because in that 7 days, you're factoring in all those things. Usually we don't. And I like to always say, it's like if I was going to the hospital and the surgeon, before giving me surgery, says, hey, I'm about to operate on you, but I'm just going to wash my hands first, okay, and do the whole thing that they do. And you say, no, hurry up, I just want you to do the surgery real quick, right? Nobody's going to do that, because we all understand that this is the best practice of what surgeons do in their medical profession. But for some reason, when it comes to engineering, the business doesn't understand the best practices of engineering, the washing hands and the sanitization, and those things, they think they're an afterthought. So we need to develop a language to say, hey, your application that you've given me needs this amount of time for it to be usable by the real person, right? Just like the sculpt, the whatever tool that you've given me to operate on this person needs the correct amount of heat for it to be, for the germs to go away before we can use it on somebody. And I feel like if we can develop that vocabulary and bring these risks in a plain English to the business, then it becomes their risk to take, to say, yes, go ahead and operate on me, but do not wash your hands. That's all I can say on that.
When you look at the government agenda, my question goes to Ghislaine. We are embracing a digital economy. And when it comes to the critical challenge we have in this use of technology is a cyber security. I think that's why NCSA came on time. So when you look at the work of NCSA comes to policy, regulation, and so on, what I want to ask is about on the ground implementation of that policy and regulation
this is the community of developers and cybersecurity practitioners. But what are the initiatives does NCSI has to support the ecosystem to make sure that we have cyber resilience? I don't think if all of us, we understand this. In terms of securing the society, because in a business effect, you will see that there is a client effect, money effects, investors, even the reputation. That's what we need to secure for businesses. Those initiatives should be there as a recommendation, but I'm not sure if we have some initiatives and program that is going to support this ecosystem to build this cyber resilience. Thank you very much.
Just to conclude the conversation, thank you so much to our panelists, and I hope all the people here, they learned a lot how to include security in all parts of the software development lifecycle. So yeah, you can catch up with Ghislaine, you can catch up with all the panelists, catch the food, and also we'd like to invite you for happy hour tomorrow if you guys are available, just to catch up with you and keep on this conversation going, because security is very important. Thank you so much.